Good evening, everyone. My name is Bruce Roeder. I am president and founder of the Museum of Political Corruption. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, I am delighted to welcome you to the first annual Nellie Bly Award for Investigative Reporting Ceremony and Roundtable. Tonight, we honor the recipient of the 2017 Nellie Bly Award, Suzanne Craig of the New York Times. We also honor the legacy of our award's namesake, the intrepid 19th century journalist Nellie Bly. It was just a few blocks from here in 1888 at the Kenmore Hotel on Pearl Street that Nellie Bly, a 24-year-old reporter working for Pulitzer's New York World, met with the lobbyist Ed Phelps. Bly had heard that one could purchase the New York State Legislature to pass or kill any bill, so she went undercover to test that theory. Phelps told her he could facilitate the transaction for $1,250. She agreed, and a bill she selected was killed. Later, when Phelps asked for his money, Nellie Bly excused herself from the table, returned her paper, and wrote an expose about the experience. Corruption in Albany in the 1880s. Who knew? I should mention, parenthetically, that because the price tag for the New York State Legislature was $1,250, our award has been appropriately set at that amount. And I don't think Suzanne would mind me telling the true story that when I met her for lunch over the summer to present her award, I appropriately handed her the envelope under the table. But not to worry, Suzanne, I'm sure Donald Trump will see to it that the envelope's contents are properly represented on your tax return. Tonight, we not only salute Suzanne Craig and Nellie Bly, but all journalists who work boldly and bravely to inform the public, whose currency are facts and the truth. This evening, we also reflect on the wisdom of the Founding Fathers who placed in the First Amendment to the Constitution protections for the press. Given the times in which we live, we can appreciate just how prescient they were. Perhaps just as Hugo L. Black put it best in his 1971 ruling in the case of New York Times Company versus United States, when he stated, "In the First Amendment, the Founding Fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors." Akin to the mission of the press, the Museum of Political Corruption is likewise founded upon the proposition that our democracy is strengthened by an informed electorate. People often ask me how I came to found the museum. You want to know something? I think Suzanne is partly to blame. You see, I founded the museum in part because I grew tired of all the constant scandalous headlines that she and her colleagues were churning out about Albany. So thanks, Suzanne, for the extra work and for all the times people have come up to me and said, you can't build it big enough or soon enough. But on a positive note, Suzanne's stories did not lead me to despair. Rather, her words were a call to action. And now the Museum of Political Corruption will serve as a call to action. Our institution will provide historical perspective and offer empowerment. Our institution is not going to be about finger-pointing, but rather learning from the past so we can point the way forward. Albany as a leader in ethical governance? Who knew? We knew, and we know this is possible. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to personally congratulate our award winner, Suzanne Craig. When we began the selection process for this award, Suzanne's work was well known to me, but her name was simply a byline, albeit a very impressive byline. Having gotten to know Suzanne over these past months, having experienced her engaging sense of humor and her generous spirit, I am deeply honored to call her a friend, which makes this evening's celebration for me all the more special. Now, before I yield the mic, there are people to thank for making this evening possible. First and foremost, I thank our wonderful Board of Trustees that helped guide this project. I thank those individuals who served on the Award Selection Committee, Thomas Bass, Chair, Maeve Tour, Rosemary Armeo, Susan Arbetter. I thank those who helped organize this event, Susan Weber, John Dion, Susan Arbetter, Maeve Tour, and Scott Osborne. A shout out to Donna Kuba for the beautiful display on Nellie Bly, and a thank you to Lindsay Perkins for working on our printed program. And a debt of gratitude to our development team of Alicia Scott Heather, Michael Genovese, John Dion, and Natasha Albanesians, who worked behind the scenes. And last but certainly not least, a special thanks to all those who contributed to our funding campaign last spring, which made this all possible. I hope you will join me in a round of applause for all these wonderful individuals. Now it's time to introduce the individual into whose capable hands I place the rest of this evening's program. Tonight's moderator, Susan Arbetter. As many of you know, Susan is the host of WCNY's syndicated public radio program, Capitol Press Room, which broadcasts live from the third floor of the state capitol weekdays from 11 to noon. Susan is the recipient of the 2013 Emmy Award for Best for her television show Insight. She was named Best Local Radio Personality by the Albany Times Union, Best Laugh in the Valley by Hudson Valley Magazine, and Favorite Voice by Berkshire Living Magazine.
No longer exists.
Having gotten to know Susan very well while planning this event, I can tell you she's all that and more. We're thrilled to have her here, and please, Susan Arbetter.
My first order of business is to introduce the person who is going to introduce Suzanne. The wonderful Professor Thomas Bass is on the museum's board. He's a professor of English and journalism at the State University of New York at Albany. He is both an acclaimed and a prolific writer. A few of his best-known works, The Spy Who Loved Us, The Predictors, and Vietnamerica, The War Comes Home. He's appeared on Good Morning America, CNN, NPR, BBC as a commentator and is a frequent contributor to such publications as The New Yorker, Wired, and The New York Times. Please welcome Thomas Bass.
A very good night. There are a lot of enemies of the people here and co-conspirators. Let's have a round of applause for all the enemies of the people and yes, so my remarks are brief. I have 3 points to make. So this is the Nellie Bly Award for Investigative Reporting. So I thought I would explain each one of those words in that award. Starting with investigative reporting. And so why an award for investigative reporting? What's going on here? Why do we do this? Investigative reporting is the top of the journalistic game. It's dedicated to revealing the secrets of the rich, the powerful, and the politically well-connected. In other words, the secrets of people who do not want their secrets revealed. Investigative reporters often put their lives at risk. 34 journalists have been killed this year and 260 are in jail, says the Committee to Protect Journalists. And just yesterday, the Trump administration announced that it was putting 2 journalists on trial for covering the inauguration in Washington, D.C. I think of investigative reporting as a kind of Google Maps for the mind. It places me in the real world rather than one I might imagine or desire. Investigative reporting has charted the terrain from Watergate through WikiLeaks, from warrantless wiretapping to the Panama and now the Paradise Papers. The journalists working on these stories are not enemies of the people. They are among the few friends we have. They are the ones informing us about the way the world works and how to survive in it. They are part of the reality-based crowd I prefer to hang with. Okay, number 2, why name this award after Nellie Bly? And Bruce has already mentioned this and described it for you. A few more details. Nellie Bly was actually born as Elizabeth Cochran in Cochran's Mills outside of Pittsburgh in 1864. But even more importantly, she invented investigative reporting. And I don't say that lightly. She really was in the forefront of this entire enterprise. At the age of 23, she gets her first job with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World in New York City, and her first assignment on her first job is to act insane and get herself locked up on Blackwell's Island, which is New York's notorious insane asylum for women. She succeeds in this, gets herself locked up for 10 days, gets released, no easy task, and publishes a 6-part series of articles on how horrible the conditions were on Blackwell's Island. As a result of that series of articles, New York convened a grand jury and ponied up $1 million to improve conditions for insane women in New York City. So there you have it in a nutshell. You have a reporter going out and investigating a story, successfully writing a series of articles on the story, and actually managing to get something to change, which of course is what the Museum of Political Corruption might be hoping for. Nellie Bly then, a year after getting herself locked up on Blackwell's Island, she started to investigate the corruption endemic in New York State, and as Bruce has already mentioned, the skullduggery of Sheldon Silver and Dean Skelos is nothing new, as Bly proved when she, in 1888, took the train up to Albany. And Bruce has already described it. Nellie Bly was pretending to be the wife of a snake oil salesman trying to kill a bill regulating patent medicines. And she sought out the Sheldon Silver of her day and found out exactly how much it costs to buy the entire New York State legislature. And as Bruce mentioned, that sum came to $1,250, which is why the Nellie Bly Award for Investigative Reporting is pegged at $1,250. We might eventually put some more zeros on the end of that, but that depends on you people in the audience. I'm saying a few things to our award recipient this evening. I think I have a little doll of Nellie Bly made by one of my former students. I should mention, this whole event was organized, financed by a Kickstarter campaign, organized by a couple of my students at the university, and they did exceedingly good work. And I now turn to the last part of my introduction. I'm sorry to take it so long here, and that has to do with why the award is being given to Suzanne Craig. I don't know if Suzanne is the Nellie Bly of her day. I think she looks a tad like Nellie Bly. But Suzanne is a fine investigative reporter and she's been playing for many years at the top of the game. And her biography on the New York Times website says that Craig, quote, covers the intersection of politics, money, and government. And as you can imagine, this is the sweet spot for investigative reporting on political corruption. Suzanne's widest public attention came near the end of the recent presidential election when 3 pages of Donald Trump's 1995 state tax returns showed up in her mailbox at the New York Times. The documents reveal that Trump, by losing other people's money, stiffing employees, and driving a variety of enterprises into bankruptcy, was able to take a $916 million deduction that could potentially have allowed him to avoid paying federal income taxes for up to 18 years. I quote, "This makes me smart," Trump said during the presidential debate that followed these revelations. Suzanne Craig was born in Calgary, Canada. She's one of those Canadians who travels among us. We can't tell them. She interned at Canadian newspapers straight out of college, which is how journalists get trained as journalists. And then passed through the Globe and Mail, Canada's largest newspaper, before going to work for the Wall Street Journal in New York City. She covered the wreckage of the 2008 financial collapse, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and then after a decade at the Wall Street Journal, she switched teams and went to work for the New York Times in 2010. She was the Times Albany bureau chief from 2013 to 2015, covering our local state house criminals and the shutting down of the Moreland Commission meant to investigate them. In 2015, she was posted back to New York City to cover City Hall, but the stuff in her mailbox has kept her busy investigating lots of other stories, quote, at the intersection of politics, money, and government. In conclusion, the Museum of Political Corruption, the Center for Ethical Governance, which resides within the Museum of Political Corruption, the search committee for this award, the Kickstarter donors and organizers, and the trustees of the Museum of Political Corruption are pleased to present the first Nellie Bly Award for investigative reporting to Suzanne.
I want to start by giving Bruce a tip, which is next year he's got to give the award in small dollar denominations in a brown bag. But I just want to say thanks. I can't help but have a bit of a kinship with Nellie Bly, who's, this woman who came to Albany with crazy hair, found political corruption, and it's sad that almost 100 years later I made the same journey to Albany and, wrote a book, The Moreland Commission, and the corruption going on with Shelley Silver and Dean Skelos, and I have to say Willie Rashbaum, who's in the front row today, and Tom Kaplan, who was another reporter up here, just the incredible work that I think the Three did. It was really important to me, and I just thanks Willie for coming out tonight, because it takes a village to do what we do, and I really, it not only takes your colleagues who are there every day in the trenches with you, it takes a newspaper like the New York Times and the support of people like Arthur Salzberger, who is standing behind us every day in commitment to taking months, if not longer, in these stories. He always wants to see them in sooner. But it's important work, and I really appreciate not only the colleagues that I have who are in the trenches every day, with the support of the Times. And I also want to say just to the Museum of Political Corruption, I hope one day this becomes actual bricks and mortar. I sort of secretly hope that journalists end up putting you guys out of business in terms of it'll never be a, but I think for the last 100 years we've seen that that's not happening, so I hope that this becomes a reality, because I think public awareness of political corruption is incredibly important, whether it's being done by organizations like this or by newspapers, be it, you know, the Times Union, the New York Times, or all the other incredible reporters who are in state houses across the country doing this sort of stuff. I'm covering the president right now and his finances, but I have to say, in my career of doing reporting, covering government, be it City Hall or the state capitol, which is incredibly important. And I just feel like there can never be enough eyes on it. I'm Canadian, and I grew up listening to Leonard Cohen, and when this song says, you know, you have to, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And I really believe that, and it's something I try to apply to my work and my job every day. And I just want to salute investigative journalism. I'm really glad that we're here tonight celebrating it. I'm really honored that I was the recipient. I'm really glad that we're celebrating and we're talking about it. So with that, Susan.
Put one there, and we're going to put one here. And the first thing we're going to do is do a little 10-minute one-on-one kibitz with our Woman of the Year, Suzanne Craig. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, does it work? Is it working? Yep. All right. So I follow Sue on Instagram. I also follow her dog, but that's for another night. On the day that Suzanne's colleagues at the Times, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, broke the Harvey Weinstein story, she took a photo of a group of reporters gathered around a computer watching the story unfold, and all the tweets coming in and all the commentary. And in the foreground of the photo was a sticker that said, "The truth is hard," which is the New York Times advertising slogan. But it's so much more than that, isn't it?
It had something really snuck in there too. It said, somebody had written on my button, "The truth is really hard."
The truth is really hard.
Yeah.
It is.
It really is.
The truth is really hard, which is why investigative journalists are sort of the superheroes of the journalism world. I thought that we could start by talking about you, and I know you're so excited about that.
This is where I have my trick question. It's off top.
I actually thought people would be interested, though, in how you came to be at the Times. Like, just tell us your trajectory, and if you always wanted to be an investigative journalist. We know you grew up in Canada. That was pointed out to us. You welcome on us. Thank you.
No, you know, the interesting thing about this, you're sort of an investigative journalist, but I always grew up thinking that every reporter is an investigative journalist, and I didn't sort of go to school thinking I wanted to be a reporter, and I sort of think that's what I am, and I actually don't sort of wear the first part of that title every day and out there, because I grew up and I got on in a paper covering the police beat and worked my way through newspapers and ultimately got on at the New York Times, and now I happen to have the honor of being one of very few people in the investigative unit. It's an incredible honor. But you're every day you're chasing a story, and the ones that I'm doing now happen to be a longer term, but I just love reporting.
While it might not be something that you distinguish in your own mind, it definitely is distinguished by the business model of newspapers. I mean, investigative reporting is the most expensive kind of reporting, and some of the stories you do, as you mentioned, take a really long time.
Really long time.
Yeah. So is investigative journalism an endangered species at this point?
Well, it's interesting because I think when you answer that question, you have to delineate between the New York Times and a lot of other newspapers. And I think at the Times they're seeing, and I think they put a great emphasis in the past several years on investigative reporting and on delivering something that's really different. But I think at the same time that you're seeing the New York Times, I think leaning into spending, you know, if your editor, a lot of times, you know, we have to cover the daily news, and a lot of people do, but I think they're also putting a premium on different sort of content. I think it's really come at a crucial time in journalism in America, because so many papers are cutting back, and it's really hard to watch that at the same time that I think the New York Times has made a decision. They want to see more investigative reporting and more longer-term stuff at a time when I think America's never broadly needed more investigative reporting. I think it's being cut back, and it's really been hard to watch.
We also need that kind of reporting at the local level. We're lucky here in Albany with the Times Union, but there are definitely great gaps in local reporting too.
No, and I think that's, and I think in a way New York has got an incredible crew of reporters covering the State House, and I worked there for 2 years, and there was so much going on in terms of just the depth of reporting that was happening, but I think you're seeing an emphasis being placed on the White House, not necessarily at the expense of the other levels, but you're definitely seeing cutbacks at city halls and state houses, and it's hard to watch because, you know, Trump he is like a car accident where everybody slows down, and they want to pour so much resources into it, and I think rightly, but we should also we shouldn't be looking away from the other things that are going on.
So why don't you tell us what happened prior to September 23rd, 2016, which is the day that Sue found someone stuffed some tax returns in her mailbox, in her literal, like the mailbox at the New York Times. What was going on before then that someone might think of you?
Nobody's ever asked me that question, so I don't like that. It sort of does answer why I would have been a reporter in America, why I got sent those returns, which is something that I've asked myself a lot. How random was that? And we had been spending, and I've been working for almost a year. It was crazy. I was in Albany for 2 years, and then I got asked to come down and run the City Hall bureau for the New York Times. And after a week, my bosses came to me and they said, we'd like you to do one story, this big story on Donald Trump and his business connections in New York. And the reason that I got asked to do that was because I had spent over a decade of my career covering Wall Street and covering finances. And I had this intersection of understanding both New York and understanding finances. And this one story turned into another story and another story. I remember every primary contest I would come in thinking, okay, I'm going to be back at City Hall the next day. It never happened. I still have yet to go back to City Hall. And I spent all of last year doing a number of stories looking at Donald Trump's finances before a lot of people were writing about him very early on. And then I came into the office in late September 2016. Probably still one of the few people who actually checks my literal mail. And I found 3 pages of Donald Trump's tax returns from 1995 in my mailbox. So the lead up was that we'd spent a whole year phoning. I phoned everybody on Wall Street talking about his finances, and spent an entire year just having that discussion with people, and then one day they arrived.
So people knew that you were on the scent.
Yes.
So to speak. So how do you verify something like that? Like what if, just think about it, Ruth, what if you got some of these tax returns in your mailbox? What would you do?
Give them to her.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know.
Right answer.
Yeah, so how did you verify it?
Well, it's interesting because when that came here, it came and we were staring at it, and even if it was true and it wasn't a prank, we get a lot of stuff we get a lot of elaborate hoaxes sent to us. So even if they were true, the barrier to publication, I knew, even if those were real, it was almost impossible. Because we would have to get verification from Donald Trump, Marlon Maples Trump who signed them, or Jack Mitnick, the accountant who signed them, and even then, we would still need another source. Like, it was just impossible, even if you have somebody's tax returns, to verify them basically requires the individual to say it's mine and one of the signatories on it. So the first 4 days after we got them, we spent an incredible amount of time not phoning these people, but understanding what we had in our hands. I immediately went to a colleague of mine who had spent months already working this story, a reporter by the name of David Barstow. And we just started poring over these, and we brought in 2 other colleagues, Megan Toohey, one of the reporters who's involved in the Weinstein reporting, and another reporter named Russ Buettner from the Metro section. Each of them had a specialty. Megan Toohey happened to have some expertise in Donald Trump's relationships in terms of his ex-wives and had sources in that world. Russ Buettner is incredibly well educated in terms of the casinos, and we felt the casino commissions may be a way into confirmation of the returns. The four of us, before we even made an outbound call, we went through every line of the return just to understand what we were seeing, so that when we made an outbound call, we would be able to have an educated conversation. If what we thought we had was true, which we eventually, after a few days, began to realize it was, we'd just be able to have that conversation. We hired 2 tax experts in those 4 days before. We got them on a Friday, and by Tuesday, we felt we were prepared to phone one of the people who had signed the tax returns, and that was Jack Mitnick, who was the accountant who had signed them for Donald Trump. And we actually didn't call him. We were ready to go see him, and instead of phoning him, we showed up at his door in Florida. David Barstow, my colleague, went down and began a discussion with him.
Just think about the resources that takes, though. Okay, you know, we're going to go down to Florida on the off chance that maybe this Jack Mitnick is the Jack Mitnick who signed these forms.
You know, 80-something-year-old accountant
yeah.
who signed the forms.
And we'll remember.
Yeah, and after we hired an accountant, we brought in people to look at the returns. And I actually was at the point where, I remember being on the phone at 9 or 10 at night, you know, trying to get a hold of people who could verify signatures on the forms. Like, we tried everything before we actually went to Jack Mitnick.
And there was even these 2 little numbers that didn't look quite right on the form. And you guys were thinking, well, could this be faked somehow? And Jack Mitnick had the answer for you.
Well, we were wishing that we'd actually videotape all our fights about whether the returns are real or not. And one of the issues was all the numbers didn't quite correspond, and we had these big fights about why they didn't correspond. The typeface was different. So we get to Jack Mitnick's house. David Barstow went down, and he gets to his house, and there's a lot of obstacles now in our way because he lives in a retirement community, and it's a gated community. And he
lives next door to you.
He's in a fight with his retirement community, and as part of this, they won't let cars up to his house, and he has to come down to greet anybody who's there. And David managed to talk his way onto the phone with Jack Mitnick through the security guard, and Jack has heard from a million reporters, and this is another kind of issue with investigative reporting, I guess. He'd heard from us too, but he wouldn't have anything to do with us. And finally, David just laid it on the line with him because we knew what we were seeing, and he says, "I'd like to talk to you about this $1 billion net operating loss, which we had spent last week round the clock trying to understand what that number on tax return." There was this big silence on the phone, and Jack Mitnick says, "I'll meet you at a bagel shop the next morning." So I think that the idea, and it's a hard thing, but having information and being as informed as you can and prepared as you can when you go to the door has really been the lesson. You know, I've learned it many times over my career, but no more than the last year. The preparation is everything, no matter how long it takes. And that got us for Jack to, and he had a lot of confidentiality agreements in terms of things he couldn't talk about the tax returns, but he confirmed it was his signature on the paper. We were able to have the conversation we needed with him to have a comfort level that allowed us on the Saturday to go to Donald Trump, who ultimately confirmed the fact his 1995 tax returns.
Before we bring the other reporters up on the stage, I did want to ask you about one other story. And this is a 2014 story with the headline, "Cuomo's Office Hobbled Ethics Inquiries by Moreland Commission," bylined by you, William Kay, and Tom Kaplan.
It was an incredible, it was my first introduction to Albany. The Moreland Commission, so I couldn't imagine. And I can't say enough about the 2 reporters who we worked on it with. I mean, it was just I came from covering Wall Street to wanting a change, and I sort of I mean, I think they were looking for somebody to cover Albany, and I was like, hey, that sounds cool. Little did I know. And the first story, the first big story that we worked on was the Moreland Commission story, and I remember they shut it down in March, and my head was just spinning like, what's going on? And Tom's looking at me going, this is really bad. And we called Willie. We're like, let's get down to New York and let's talk about this. And 3 months later, the paper was all in on just finding out. They just wanted to know exactly what had gone on. And we just went crazy trying to figure it out. And 3 months later, we published that story.
Just what was one of the big revelations that you could share with the folks here?
The interesting thing that we found was that the governor's office had shut it down after the Moreland Commission began to look at the governor's office itself and some of the things that were going on in the governor's office, and just how political that commission was. It was really I kind of came in really as an outsider, and it was just stunning to me just how politically something that should have been right was. To be honest, it was really disappointing as somebody who just watches the political process. That's something I think Albany really needed, something like the Moreland Commission. And to this day, it's one of the most disappointing things I've ever seen in terms of things I've witnessed as a reporter, in terms of how the governor's office mishandled and abused their power in that situation.
So there are a lot more stories that we're going to mine tonight. So if I could have, Rex and John and Willie and Kim come on up here. And this is going to be awkward, but we're going to move the chairs back down. Yeah, just the camera. And you guys are going to pass these microphones up and down?
Oh, it's just...
Mic wasn't working. Well,
1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, that's good. Now
Yeah. Great. I said earlier that the truth is hard, and Suzanne amended that to the truth is what, really, really hard? Really freaking hard. And it takes a special kind of person to devote themselves to it, like Nellie Bly, who faked insanity to report from behind the walls of the Blackwell Island Women's Lunatic Asylum. She was there for 10 days, living in squalid conditions so she could report on the mistreatment of women. So in the spirit of Nellie, tonight's panel discussion is dissecting the relationship between government and the media in a time of Trump and Cuomo. And our panelists are Suzanne Craig, and we have Willie Rashbaum, who's the senior writer of the New York Times, covering corruption, crime, and the myriad miscreants of our day, which I stole from your Twitter account. Then we have Kim Barker, a reporter from the Times Metro desk and the author of The Taliban Shuffle, which was made into a movie, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, starring Tina Fey. And we have Brad Smith next to her, who's the editor of the Times Union since 2002. And on the panel we have John Carr, who's the senior advisor for strategic communication for the New York State Unified Court System, a former reporter for the Albany Times Union, and co-author of The Curious Case of Kiryas Joel with Utah. So we're going to talk for about a half hour, 45 minutes, and then we're going to open up the questions to the floor to you guys. So I want to start by channeling my inner Sean Hannity, Suzanne. This makes my tushy hurt. Why does the public need the media to play the role of government watchdog? Why can't the media simply be neutral conduits for communication of information? Good question. Is it on?
Yeah. I think our job is to shine a light. And I think that we can do both. So I don't think they're not necessarily exclusive roles, but I think that our job, no matter whether there's a Republican or a Democrat in power, is to ask questions and to look at how public money is spent. So I don't see them as necessarily, I mean, I think you can cover the events of the day, but I think it's also important to do that.
Rex, do you want to weigh in on this?
I think
A lot of paper.
there's no such thing as neutral information. The difficulty with conveying purely, yeah, I don't know, this thing doesn't seem to be working. It's, let's try that. Is that better? No.
Okay, pass that.
How about that? Yeah. This is green, but it's not. Can you hear that? Yeah. How about that? I was saying I don't think there is any such thing as neutral information. Oftentimes, facts are not true. The conveyance of what someone asserts as fact will lead to a lie being told. I'll just give you a quick example. Right after I went to the Times Union as managing editor, George Pataki was governor. He had been governor for about 9 months when we went up to the annual meeting of the Business Council of New York State at Sagamore. And I sat in the audience as I was going to be leading a panel discussion the next day. And I watched him make this declaration that he had turned around the economy of New York State in his 9 months in office. You know, he's a big guy. He stretched his arms wide and he said, "What a turnaround! What a story!" And so our reporter who was covering it wrote, "What a turnaround, what a story," the governor said. And the next day when I read the story, I thought, no. For one thing, the economy of New York State, if it were an independent nation, would be the 5th largest nation in the world. You can't turn a battleship that big by just throwing the rudder, throwing the tiller. So it seemed unlikely to me that he turned around the economy of New York State. So we did end up getting, eventually we tried to determine how you would see if the economy of New York really were better under George Pataki than it was under Mario Cuomo, whom I had covered as a reporter for a downstate paper. And it was interesting. We got some econometric consulting firms to tell us how they would measure the economy of New York State. We got 7 different indices, new housing starts and employment and that kind of thing. And by the time we did the story, because I was the managing editor and the editor of the paper at the time didn't really want to do this story. By the time we did it, we had 2 years of data. The first 2 years of Pataki compared to the last 2 years of Mario Cuomo. And we found that on 5 of the 7 indices of economic activity, New York was doing worse than Pataki than Mario Cuomo. So the question is, which story was true? People say, just tell us the facts, right? So just give us a neutral accounting of the facts. We did that when we told the story of what the governor said, but it wasn't a true story. The true story was what we told later, the interpretive reporting, and that's why you have to do the investigative reporting, because facts often don't tell you the truth.
I would agree with that.
So Kim or John?
I certainly agree with that. I certainly hope I'm not the one who wrote the first story. but a couple of thoughts on that. I think Rex is right that neutrality is not the goal, truth is the goal. And you can be neutral and report that 1 and 1 is 3 and the other person said 1 and 1 is 7. You can dutifully report what each side said and you not report the story. But it's a lot easier said than done. You were able to funnel the resources to do this.
Can you talk up? Speak up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Rex was able to marshal the resources at that time to do that sort of analysis. And I'm not sure that is feasible for many newspapers this much later. And getting back to your original question, though, I think, the older I get, the more I appreciate checks and balances, certainly in government, from every branch. And I certainly look at the press as one of those checks and balances. Not the holy one necessarily. We've got our own flaws. But just another force, another check and balance to keep the others in check. And I know it has an impact. I know it has an effect. And I fear that it's having less of an effect for a couple of reasons. One being the one I just mentioned, that I don't know that the resources are there with many papers now to do a sort of analysis that Rex commissioned in, 1995 or whatever that was.
Well, it costs, and then there are costs. Okay, William Rashbaum. The price to be paid for this work is that in the case of Trump's tax returns, for example, he threatened to sue you. Right? In the case of Roy Moore, he's threatened to sue the Washington Post. This all costs a lot of money to do investigative reporting, and then, of course, you have to worry about this kind of liability. How does that affect an investigation?
Well, again, I think at the Times we're very fortunate that we have a in-house lawyer, a team of lawyers really, who can respond to these to actual lawsuits, and also will respond to these have been in, I'm sure, both those cases. I know less about Roy Moore, but in terms of Trump and others who are quick to threaten to sue, Harvey Weinstein most recently. You know, the last thing somebody like Harvey Weinstein or Donald Trump wants to do is get involved in litigation where they're going to be required to go through the discovery process, which would mean they would have to turn over information to their adversary, which in that case would be the New York Times. So that's generally just a lot of windbagging. But there are people who will, who will sue, and there are people who, with deep pockets, who will set out to engage media organizations. I mean, Gawker is the most recent example. What's that?
Peter Thiel.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the person who sued Gawker?
Hulk Hogan sued Gawker, but it was finance. But at the Times, I mean, I'm not really an expert on the Gawker suit, but at the Times, if we get sued, we have a team of lawyers, whether the suit is frivolous or not. We have a team of lawyers who are extremely capable and smart and aggressive, and
this is what we're
capable of responding. Smaller news organizations and even large news organizations that don't have some of the resources that we have, and our resources aren't limitless, but and they're certainly more limited today than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago.
Suzanne?
But we're capable.
Oh, yeah, sure.
The one thing that I would say is I don't think it's really a danger so much right now of lawsuits or even threatening lawsuits. The danger that we face now in investigative reporting is that if it used to appear in the New York Times or the Washington Post or in 60 Minutes, people believed it. People believed 1 year of reporting, they believed the documents, they believed that what came out was true. And now they don't necessarily believe it. You can dismiss an investigative story that takes years of work simply by saying this is fake news. And it's become so partisan, and the media has become so partisan that no longer do people just intrinsically believe the mainstream media. And I think that's a real problem in our democracy, and I don't know how we fix that.
I would just say that I think that doubt and skepticism is not a bad thing when it comes to what we publish, but our credibility has been, everybody should be skeptical about everything. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but our credibility has been so eroded. That is something that at times, that to a degree, I think the media bears some responsibility for. But in the current environment, also, it is so polarized and so aggressive, and the ability of people, and not just the current administration and the current president, but of others to, the president has been a very effective teacher in that people have learned that if they say over and over again simply that the story is not true, there are some people, sometimes many, sometimes few, but there are people who will believe them.
Don't we have a responsibility, though, as citizens in a democracy, to, figure out what's fake news, what's biased news, what's news that is, done with integrity behind it and wants to work. I mean, what's the responsibility of the citizen?
How do citizens make that determination? You know, this is why news literacy is so important, and why we need to try to help people understand how to differentiate propaganda, public relations, advertising, publicity, and the journalism and verification we practice. All of those have a place, but they're not journalism. And trying to teach people how to recognize stories that have credible sources, multiple sources, to back them up, as opposed to simply assertions absent substantiations. And finding people who really care enough to wish to make that differentiation is really
I
difficult.
think that's like a crucial point. I think it's differentiating the guy who's got an internet book up in his basement in the New York Times and saying, you know, what is the difference? And I think it's forcing people to, you know, I think it's putting the obligation on people to sort of seek out the difference between the two. And even the New York Times, I mean, I think to Willie's point, we should be questioning every news outlet, and I think that that's what the last year or two has brought upon us in a really real way. But I think what Donald Trump has been effective in doing is just by calling everything fake news. I think he's really cast in it. It's been an attack on the media, like anything we've seen, and it's really unfortunate.
I just want to say one quick thing, and that's that, you know, what we hear a lot, and I think people fail to recognize to a certain degree that they see the situation that we're in, and they may blame the president, they may blame the media, but there's not a lot of discussion about how we're in this situation, and I don't think that, you know, Donald Trump's approach to these things is necessarily the problem. I think it's a symptom of a larger problem that you know, so many people are so suspicious and unhappy and have been feel that they have been so wrong by so many, by the government, by their political party, by their, you know, by so many aspects of their lives. But we don't look at, you know, why are we in this position? How did Donald Trump get elected? How did that happen? We can't look at the number of people who voted for him and say, well, they don't think like me, so they're all stupid. And that, frankly, is the root of the problem.
That might be beyond the scope of this conversation, but one thing that we could do is talk about the current state of government and media and the tension there. And Kim, I think that you probably have some thoughts on that. At least I have.
What's the specific question?
Do you think the tension has gone bad between government and the media? I mean,
well, sure. I mean, like, I think it's obvious. Anybody who, you know, it seems like there's just a very adversarial role between, and there always is, right? Especially if you're doing an investigative story. I mean, if you call up and you say, hey, I want to talk to you, I'm doing a public records request. I think any time in my entire career, probably in these guys' career too, nobody's thrilled to have to fill that public records request. Few people are leaving to help you, but now, what I've noticed, especially in New York State, and I've worked in a lot of other places, but I've never been in a place that is this unfriendly to filling public records requests. Whether in the city or in both places, I'm pretty sure that anytime I do one, they don't just go to the agency, they've got to be vetted through, you know, either the mayor's office or the governor's office, and then what comes back to you is, why do you need this? What is the story you're doing? And if you sit there and say, it's just a public record, I'm entitled to it, then it's like, I feel like it goes into the slow down pile. You've got to somehow make friends to be able to get the information that you're actually entitled to as a journalist. And it's almost like, you know, the whole way to get you to not do a story is to just stall, and maybe 3 years down the road you might get the information, but it's all going to be redacted anyway. And it's just become, and Obama did this federally. It's like Obama was master of not fulfilling FOIA requests. And you know, I don't know if that goes to the tension, but I think it goes to the way that they're just trying to not let you do any story that's remotely critical. And that, like, that tension just seems to be building and building and building.
And there's an element of it too that goes to the resources issue.
Yeah.
Because you need the resources to be able to file a suit. We just, actually on our front page today, we have a story about winning an appeal where we were denied a document that we needed. And there are legal fees paid because the law says that when a government denies your access to documents that you by right ought to have, such that it is clearly a willful act of cover-up. Those are my words, that's not quite what the statute says. The government has to pay you. So the Hearst legal team, thank you very much, is going to be reimbursed by the town of Milton in Sarasota. You need to have the resources, though, to put out there, and this is why it's very difficult. And here's Diane Kennedy from the New York News Publishers Association, which does run a legal service for small newspapers, so that if a small organization needs legal help to figure out this kind of thing, to file those lawsuits, there actually is a way to do that. But you know, the training of law, and the other element too is getting in smaller communities, having reporters who having reporters who need to go back. The same reporter goes back in a newsroom where there are maybe 3 or 5 reporters. They're going back every day to the same town supervisor, asking them for everything, and having the courage and the wherewithal to be able to press forward on these difficult, challenging reporting tasks is a really difficult thing in the small towns across America, especially as resources are increasingly depleted.
The impact of relentless attacks on the media and viewing the media as the enemy. John Carr, you have worked both inside government and as a reporter covering government under different administrations, Patterson and Cuomo. What can you tell us about that? How do they view the media differently?
It was an enormous difference. It's just a little bit of background. I've been in journalism for 25 years. I thought of myself as uniquely unqualified to be a flag. I was recruited for something in the Spitzer administration, and with some reluctance I went there. There was an attitude, I thought there was a bit of an ethic. I thought there was an attitude, a healthy tension with the press. That changed with the current administration abruptly, and in my mind, it was kind of scary actually. You know, and it was very the hostility you mentioned is palpable, and I don't know where it comes from really, but you know, it's kind of an example. In the past, when Rex's reporters would call me up and ask me how many murders there were, I was at the Division of Justice Wing. How many murders were there in Troy last year? And I grabbed the green book and I'd see there were 4, and I said there were 4, and I get out of my day. And under the new administration, I wouldn't be able to answer that question. It would have to go to the second floor. And the response would be something along the lines of, well, what are they working on? Where's the story going? I don't know where the story is going. We'll call them back and find out. And don't give them the answer, make them file a FOIA. And it was just this, you know, in fairness, I don't know if this was coming from the governor. You know, I didn't deal with him. I know that was the attitude, certainly, of some of the cabinet. And I know that was the attitude of the press office that was populated at that time. You know, previously the press office, and not just the second floor press office, but the press apparatus throughout and the agencies and that, was generally populated by former reporters and communications professionals. The Cuomo administration, I don't think that was the case, at least at first. They were political operatives, and they worked that way and they thought that way. And there was certainly an attitude that the press was
A pain in the ass.
well, that's probably the impression of every administration was probably right, but I think
out to get the government.
Well, there was an attitude that the press was something to be tolerated and you had no choice, and exploited whenever possible. And that made me very, very, very uncomfortable.
So Willie, when you approached the Cuomo administration, when you were first reporting on the Moreland Commission with Sue and Tom Kaplan, how did they respond to you?
They were not happy. They were never happy. I mean, there is not always, but often can be an adversarial relationship between the press and government agencies or government. But in my experience for many, many years, it was always professional. You had a job to do, they had a job to do, and it didn't even have to be unfriendly. But, with the current administration in Albany, it more frequently than not becomes angry, and they tend to take things almost as if they're taking it personally, that you're writing a story that might say that there are actually 10 kumquats instead of 8 kumquats, or whatever the facts may be. That if you do not see the facts the way they see the facts, that you're a bad person, or you're
Said something about their grammar.
right. It just it's a bizarre attitude, and it's hard not to see it as something that comes from the top, when it is so it's a view that's so widely represented throughout the ranks.
Did either of you ever get a call from the governor himself screaming at you on the phone? Because we have heard that happens sometimes. Suzanne.
He never screamed at me, but I'm still waiting.
He vowed very early on he would never speak to me ever again as long as he lived, and I think he's held to that. So he did not call me. He certainly called many.
Yeah, our editors perhaps were not so fortunate.
He called everybody up to appreciate the New York Times. He didn't call the reporters.
Yeah, I mean, the Moreland story was interesting in that ultimately, when they finally responded to our questions, they sent us, I think, a 17-page.
Well, it was hard to count.
I think it was a 17-page response to our questions. And we were struggling because we wanted to get as much of it into the story as we could. And then an editor came up with the idea that we would just simply, we didn't have to put that much of it in the story, because we'd simply publish the whole thing online, which we thought was a great idea. The Cuomo administration was irate. I mean, they went nuts.
They wouldn't sit down with us, and then they were irate that we would publish their letter. And I guess you say, as though we wanted to engage with them.
As though somehow we tricked them by publishing their letter.
How much have sent us a letter? I'm going to say, I've covered the whole problem
It was bizarre.
for 2 years now, and I can say, in my 2 years in Albany, I have never witnessed anything like the hostility that the Cuomo administration demonstrated towards the media, in terms of at least where I sat as running the bureau in the New York Times. It was unbelievable, their response to FOIA requests, their response to simple phone calls, the hostility and the anger and the suspicion of which they view the media is like nothing I have seen in my career, which has now spent numerous years. It was unbelievable.
And
day in and day out.
The shocking thing also was that many of the people who were, line agency bureaucrats, whether they were working in the agency or press officers, there were many of them who you could tell, and sometimes they would, if they felt comfortable enough with you, they would be candid and say, like, I can't, they would tell you they were being told they needed to do. They were told to do this, they were told to do that, they were told not to give you this, or not to tell you that, or not to, and it was like they were hostages. You felt like you were talking to someone who was whispering on the phone in the basement, and they weren't going to let them out. And they wanted them to yell at you, right? They wanted them to yell at us. It was clear that they were instructed to be, get tough with them.
Yelling's a big
Which I don't think they realized that, this is what we do. Yelling at us isn't gonna, we're not gonna cry. We're not gonna get all flustered and okay, I'll write the story. Sorry. They yell at us and it actually provides more entertainment.
So, Ken, you've worked in New York, you've worked, you covered the Trump administration, the Cuomo administration. What are the similarities there? Because it sounds like perhaps there are a few.
I mean, I haven't covered Trump. I've covered Afghanistan. I can talk about warlords. That sounds like a more apt comparison. It's amazing. I feel like I feel like I'm a broken record. I feel like I file public records requests and nobody ever fulfills them. And you do the story anyway. And then you might get a public record, you might get something a few years later. Might be a story, might not be, but it's just really challenging. And I think that that's become a new way that every incoming administration, whether they're Democratic or Republican, let's just not give them what they want. Let's just, we get nothing out of being kind to the media. When, in fact, if you're actually, and maybe if they just got more people who used to work in the media to actually be spokespeople, I think inherently if people give you what you want, if you say, yeah, there were 4 murders here last year, then you're going to think that's a great spokesman. And you just intrinsically feel better about the person. Not that you're going to go easier on them, but you don't have this adversarial thing, and you just realize that at the end of the day, it's your job, and it's their job to do what they're doing.
So maybe we can ask Rex, who covered you covered under Mario Cuomo.
He learned it from his dad.
Okay.
Really? Do tell. No, actually, the difference is that there were times when Mario Cuomo would become so angry with the press that he would walk away from us and refuse to speak to the reporters who were there. In those days, of course, we also traveled a lot with the governor. There was a slow twin-engine state plane from the G1 that would carry the governor all over the state. It had a large cabin, 4 seats a bench seat for 4 reporters across from where the governor and the swivel and the press secretary swivel, and some seats in the back. The governor would at times simply sit there in stoic silence as we would be trying to get him to speak to us, looking straight ahead, not hearing us. The difference, what was typically the case, however, is that he was very confident of his intellect and sure that he could persuade us and talk his way out of any difficult situation with the reporter. He wasn't afraid to engage because he was not at all he did not at all lack confidence, Mario Cuomo. And I think that actually served him rather well. He was elected 3 times in New York State, 3 4-year terms. No other governor had that at that time. And while he certainly at times had a terrible situation with the press, and there were a lot of stories that he hated, his housing commissioner had to resign when it turned out that the governor had been lying about creating a million homes for the homeless, similar to actually housing stories that the current governor Cuomo tells. There were a lot of issues that were difficult, but still, I think that there was more of an engagement at the time because he was a confident politician. I was a political flag for 4 years earlier when I was a young man on Capitol Hill. So I've been on that other side of the notebook, but I worked for a politician who similarly was rather confident in his competence. And I wonder how much of this is because we had how much of this hostility is because we have fragile egos in political circles, and people greatly worry that their lives are going to be torn apart by the next story in the press.
There's one thing I want to add, which I think it's sort of also incumbent on the media when these situations happen to sort of, not so much speak out, but it's how do we hold ourselves to them. And I think one thing that we did when I was in Albany that I was proud of it because I think it took a lot of fortitude to do, which is when the governor said that he was no longer ever going to speak to me after I'd been the bureau chief for less than 6 weeks and he didn't like my coverage. We at the bureau said that he would call in all the time and spend a lot of our time off the record taking up our time on deadline, and we couldn't use the information. And we said, okay, if the governor calls in, you're on the record. And if we're on a campaign bus with you and you want to talk to people off the record and we're there, you're on the record. And if you want to have a budget briefing and you want to be a person familiar with the governor's thinking, we're not having that. If we go down to a budget briefing, you're on the record. And I think that that was a really important step that we took in terms of the accountability that he's the governor of the state. He represents the people. He's being paid by the people. And we felt it was really important to draw that line with him. And I think it created, again, more adversary. They weren't willing to have any discussion with us in terms of, the nuances that were, they weren't going to speak to me. They weren't going to deal with the bureau. So we felt that a bright line had to be drawn, that if you called anybody in the bureau or there was another reporter, that those conversations were on the record, and we also refused to attend the budget briefings, really importantly, where he would say things about various, his nemesises, and he would trash talk the mayor, and those would end up in other publications. A person familiar with his thinking, and that became unacceptable to the New York Times while I was there. And I think that was a really important step.
You worked at DC, you left the Cuomo administration, I'm sorry, to return to journalism. So you were at the TU, then you went to Spitzer, I guess, and then you worked for Patterson and Cuomo, and then you left Cuomo to return to journalism. How did the Cuomo administration respond to that?
Bizarrely. Just to correct that, I was at the New York Law Journal. I went to the Division of Criminal Justice Services for 4.5 years. So I worked 5 months under the Cuomo administration, and then I returned very, very happily to journalism. And when I returned, I can't believe I'm saying this, but when I returned, I received a letter from the administration cautioning me. And they told me that I could not file FOILs with the Division of Criminal Justice Services or any of the 12 or 13 criminal justice, public safety, Homeland Security agencies that I had done any work with. And the reasoning was, follow me from here so you can follow the perpetual logic here. The logic was that if I filed a FOIL and they denied my FOIL and I appealed their denial of my FOIL, I would then be appearing before my former agency in violation of the public officers law. And they'd fine me $1 zillion and put me in jail for 100 years. And you can certainly attend press conferences, but you can't ask questions.
Wow. Did you ever write that?
No, we didn't. The law journal opted to do it, follow the procedures, and what we did is I challenged it with the, what was it precursor to JCO? Wasn't it government integrity or? There's been so many of them.
That's right.
I appealed to them. They jerked me around for a while, went out of business. And then JCO came in. I appealed to them. They jerked me around until 2 years was up and it became moot. So it never got challenged. I regret that. Toward the end.
Because of the revolving door statute.
Right. The revolving door statute provision is 2 years. If you leave government, you can't practice before your former agency for 2 years. And obviously, the intent of that is to prevent revolving door, backdoor dealing, not to prevent journalists from obtaining public information.
You can be sure, though, that lobbyists, people who leave the administration and go to the lobbying firm where there are many lobbyists, that those people that left government are not going to sit there with like a pair of socks in their mouth and not tell their colleagues information that might be of value to them.
Well, that kind of goes to that paranoia I mentioned earlier. What were they afraid of? I did have a bit of an advantage. I knew what sort of information DCGS had. I knew what they could do. They gave me a little bit of an advantage. But what in the world were they afraid of that I was going to get? I don't think they thought about that far. I think it was, this guy's now the enemy, how do we stop him? It didn't stop me. You know, I was always able to get what I needed because my colleagues sat 5 feet away and they'd say, hey Joe, give them a call and ask them how many birds were in Troy last month.
So we have about 15 more minutes, and I want to open up the questions to you guys. Not surprised that there are a whole bunch of questions. So when you stand up, will you stand up and ask questions then? Yes, go ahead, right over here.
Okay. I have a pretty loud voice. Can you hear me? Or should I?
Yeah, that's fine.
Microphone is up there. Well, I can ask it. I think my microphone is pretty loud. So today there's a hung jury in the Menendez case, and the Supreme Court has changed the definition of corruption in some interesting ways lately. It's rather narrower now. Even the Menendez decision may indicate that there's some kind of friend exception. That seems to be something that came out of it. I wonder to what degree, what kind of definition you carry around in your heads, right? What is it when you think about it? Is there going to be some way in which the Supreme Court's decision will have to narrow your perspective as well?
I think that we all have common sense, and that's as good a guide, I think, as one can find. I mean, here in Albany, there are all kinds of things that we see that, turn our stomach, curl our hair, straighten our hair, whatever, make our hair fall out, but which are actually legal.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court decision in McDonald, there was an earlier decision relating to skilling and Enron, I think, that narrowed the honest services fraud, the way the government can use that statute. So, federal prosecutors, I think, will find ways to charge what they believe are crimes. I would be surprised if it will actually, if the changes are going to chill things, but I guess that remains to be seen. But I guess in response to your question of how, we think about it, I think, common sense is your guide. When you look at some of the things that Menendez did, if I was a New Jersey voter, I wouldn't care that there was a hung jury, or even if he got acquitted. I would look at the things that he did, which have been widely reported long before he went to trial, most of them, I think. And I wouldn't vote for the guy. So if that's the maybe where the court of public opinion has a little more bite.
Correct. Yeah. It just does. Were you about to use this too? For us, it really doesn't matter, because actually, think of one of the fundamentals of reporting, and there are reporting students here, that long before you get to investigative reporting, there is this notion of show, don't tell. And that is, we don't care whether there's a statute violated. We are showing people the reality of what's going on and let them make their own conclusions instead of telling them that there is something illegal going on. So I think that Joe Bruno is a great example. Here's a worthless horse that...
Not Joe Bruno.
Joe Bruno was given a worthless horse, which he sold to a guy who had business before the state, and he was given $80,000 for this worthless horse. The second jury in his corruption trial determined that was not a bribe. There was nothing illegal about that transaction. But, you know, a reader might find that interesting nevertheless, and that is still good journalism.
I just have to add one thing about Joe Bruno, which is that, and I think he's a colorful character, an interesting guy, but one of the things that came out of that trial I just find so fascinating, and I just want to share with everyone that I ever see when Joe Bruno comes up, and that is that Joe Bruno had, it wasn't his chief of staff, it was the, he had some senior majority staffer tell every member of the caucus, tell every Republican, that when you file your financial disclosure forms, do not send them through the mail. Because if you make a misrepresentation in there, if you send it through the mail, it's a crime. Get off your ass, go across the street, go down the street, and deliver it by hand. And then you will avoid the possibility that you committed mail fraud. Better yet, get your secretary. But so, it was written. It was in a memo. And then they briefed you. So, I mean, you can't make that up.
Okay, all the way in the back there. Yeah, you.
So, in the modern age, we have a lot of hoaxes going on, especially with the internet, and it spreads virally really quickly. How can we use the internet to get the correct information to the people, and how has the internet changed investigative reporting?
Well, those are two really good questions. I don't know. I'm going to let somebody else.
I don't know that you can use the internet to help find out correct information. Because it's like, you'll say it's correct here, and then Alex Jones will say it's not correct, and people will be like, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's correct and maybe it's not correct. So it's difficult. I mean, even like these organizations like PolitiFact and like these places that are known for vetting things, folks don't trust them. So you can use it. I just don't know that people will believe it. But wow, is the internet a boon for investigative reporting? I second that. It's amazing. In a way, I kind of miss the old days because you could go and going to look at campaign finance records and like pulling lawsuits when you actually had to go to the courthouse and like doing it all by paper. You felt like you were really discovering something. And now a lot of that stuff is, frankly, you can do a lot of it online, or you go to the courthouse and it's very easy to get. So there's a second, so that stuff is pretty easy, but the second level that you can use the internet for, and finding sources and finding trends and like scraping and being able to, you know, have all these different people have all these skills to be able to use big data in different ways is amazing. So, and then like, you know, being able to use Twitter to find people like you're looking for somebody who, victims, right? Victims, let's use like any of these recent sexual harassment revelations. Like people are talking about this on Twitter. You can find people, verify who they are, and be able to get people to illustrate stories in a much quicker time frame, especially if you're doing any of this on a quick hit deadline.
I think one thing that comes to mind is the hoax issue, and I say this, I've been covering Trump now for 2 years, and I've never seen in my career more false news come in terms of like things dressed up that are real, that are not. And we had one incident in the newsroom. It was incredible. We spent weeks trying to confirm whether or not it was true. Somebody came to us, appeared to be the real thing, and had serious information about Donald Trump's taxes, and that they had been, all of his tax audits had been closed right at the eve of the election. Had letters from IRS officers, had information about his taxes that we were surprised. We spent weeks and weeks of man-hours trying to track this down. We ended up flying to Minnesota and Minneapolis, like all these places trying to figure this out, and it ended up being a hoax, but we spent a lot of time trying to track stuff like this down the other end of that. It's incredible, just the amount of false information dressed up is pretty incredible stuff that's coming at us.
Sue, did anybody else fall for that?
We actually had Politico, as we also knew was chasing up, Politico ProPublica sort of was chasing it, and when we finally confronted the guy who we'd been dealing with for 2 weeks, and he admitted that in fact, we still don't know why he did this, but he admitted that, well, he was sort of forced to after we called his bluff and found the IRS officer that he had held out as having signed something that hadn't. We found the actual IRS officer. He'd taken some documents off the internet. We actually phoned Republica and let them know to stop doing it. And they were sort of initially skeptical when we walked them through what we had done. We had another just a crazy case where we get a call into the newsroom and there's all the Donald Trump's accountants are out on Long Island, and there was all these there was all these parked cars outside his office, and they all had out-of-state license plates. And then somebody that we knew, and the company we knew, said that the FBI is currently raiding his offices, and there's all these out-of-state license plates. And so we had the person phoned in all the license plate numbers. Willie was involved in this because we have him on like the speakerphone when we're driving out to the office, trying to figure out if we can run the plates, and we're like this could have been real. And we get there, and in fact, all these out-of-state license plates are parked outside Donald Trump's accountant's office. We write them all down, we do a full surveillance of the parking lot, and then somebody comes up to one of the cars, and people start coming out, and we go up to them and we're like, what are you doing here? And it turns out they were sales reps from Arizona Iced Tea, which was also in the building. And we're just looking at it, and all PJ Morse are like, what are you doing? This is how I spend half of my days. It's a bit off topic from your question, but like, it's maddening. It's maddening.
I just want to say, well, two things about hoaxes, I guess. One is that, again, it's hard to separate, the madness from truth sometimes, but, your common sense is your guide, and if you look at something and you think, holy shit, it's probably not true.
She'll reporting often always wins out in my view.
All right, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions right here.
Well, my concern is about freedom of the press. Maybe not be in your purview of this discussion, but it's control of the press, control of the media. And just today or yesterday, I saw where the conservative billionaire Mercer is trying to buy Time magazine. So, how do we control that?
How do we control that? Isn't it he who controls the presses controls?
It's been really interesting what's happened at the Las Vegas newspaper after Sheldon Adelson threw, of course, an LLC. Nobody knew who it was. It's this new vague owner. And what happened there was very much they did not want negative stories about like certain topics, especially Sheldon Adelson. And that could happen. I mean, that's happened when other folks have bought into the media. And what is it, Clear Channel? Is that the place that's got all the radio stations? And it happens.
There's like a documentary out there called Nobody Speak, that if the people, if you guys haven't seen it, it's well worth watching. It covers both Peter Thiel's funding of the Hulk Hogan case and also what happened at the Las Vegas review. It's an absolutely chilling documentary that I suggest everybody watch as a reminder of what happens when nobody speaks.
But one way to deal with that is to subscribe to publications that you support. And the Times Union. I mean, philanthropically funded, investigative reporting organizations. I mean, I think that ICIJ is philanthropically funded, right? There are a lot of these groups that do, ICIJ is the organization that was sort of the clearinghouse for the Panama Papers and I guess also the Paradise Papers. And so these groups, are often sort of seat of the pants operations, and whatever you can afford would go a long way to helping them do the work that they do. There's no reason why the Mercers should have the exclusive right to put their money into these kinds of endeavors. So.
But it's a huge issue.
Massive.
Right here in the red.
I was wondering, what do you think your responsibility is as reporters, or perhaps your employer's responsibility at disseminating information to school children? And do you get involved with that at all?
I mean, I don't personally get involved in it. I know the New York Times has a very big program where they provide newspapers to schools.
It is the difficulty is the newspapers and education program has primarily been a circulation vehicle, and as print circulation has been of less importance to our revenue stream, newspapers have been cutting it back. It used to be that newspapers all put a lot of papers into school classrooms. But the thing is, it's much easier to get information to school children now through digital means. Every school is wired. You don't have to drop off newspapers on their doorstep. But how do you teach them to do something? Now, again, there are programs that teach young people how to use newspapers, that teach teachers how to use newspapers to teach students. But the difficulty is getting into the classrooms when there are so many required courses filling up the school day that there isn't time to teach for the civics education that would suggest why people would need to have, why children should want to have access to this current information, and then teaching them, again, news literacy. There is a significant news literacy program there are several news literacy programs, I should say. The National Center for News Literacy is at Stony Brook University, a terrific thing created by the former editor of Newsday, who's the Dean of Journalism there now, and there is a news literacy program in the classrooms. It was a great thing to support. But our schools simply are overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that they need to get out there. So I think it really does require getting into the folks who are making curriculum decisions to encourage them to go forward with civic education, news literacy training. That's a slow process, but yes, we really need to be in schools.
With the caveat that I have no children, so I really have no standing to make this statement, but I would think that news literacy should begin at home, and that if kids see their mother and their father reading the newspaper, and see their mother and their father reading it in a way where they are getting information from it, and the family is talking about it, and whether it's at the breakfast table or the dinner table, that it becomes an important part of just being a civically minded person, and that's gonna, I think, have potentially way more impact and teach children to actually be able to make judgments for themselves, to read a news story and say, well, I don't think that's the way it should be, or I don't think that's right, or that makes me, that touches me, or it makes me angry, or it makes me, I think that's where it's got to start.
I think we're out of time. I want to thank everybody who's up here.
It's taking cash donations.
Yes, you're right. I would like to thank all of you too. We have one more small presentation. We have a corruption mug. Put your